very much. That was nice. Like millions and millions of people around the world, I struggle with procrastination. Now, contrary to the popular misconception, my particular affliction isn't to do with the fact that I'm lazy. I'm one of the hardest workers that any of you will ever meet. Doesn't even know me already. For me, the root cause of my procrastination is something that I used to think of as a strength in my character, which is actually a weakness. I'm a perfectionist. Now, I don't believe that I am perfect by any means. That would make me an egotist, right? Perfectionism is an unrelenting urge for me to strive for perfection, even though that concept probably doesn't even exist. I assure you, it's a curse. As a kid, my dad raised me to believe that if something is worth doing, it's worth doing right. How many people have heard that before? A lot of people. Great. So when I was a kid, every project that I embarked on, I really felt like I was giving it my all. I was doing everything I can to succeed and be perfect. The trouble with this mentality for me was that if I didn't think that a project was worthwhile, I didn't really try it at all. In fact, sometimes I just completely ignored it. Somehow I was able to skid my way through high school with this behavior. However, once I got to college and then into my professional career, no longer could I just simply choose to apply myself at the projects that I thought were interesting. I had to do all the work. This was a big struggle for me because all of a sudden I had to find the time to get all these things done. One of the particular tendencies of a perfectionist procrastinator like me is something that's called analysis paralysis. I think a lot of people in this room have probably heard of this before, especially if you've worked for a large organization. Analysis paralysis is a failure or a fear of failure that inhibits the ability to make decisions. People balance the pros and cons of a decision so much that they waste all their time and effort and don't ever get down to the real issues. I used to struggle with this at my jobs. I would go into sales meetings and think, oh gee, do I want to sell one big sale or do I try to get a bunch of little sales? And I would get confused because I didn't know which path to go down. I remember once I was hiring somebody to help me and I had two really great candidates and I was, again, balancing those pros and cons, almost trying to predict the future about the outcome of hiring one over the other. By the time I got around to hiring somebody, both candidates had already accepted positions with other companies. So I was stuck having to start over from scratch and go back to that pile of resumes and find two more good customers. Now, it was about 10 years ago that I finally stumbled upon a concept that's helped me at least combat the tendency of analysis paralysis. I was getting ready to head down to Australia for a business trip. And a couple of colleagues that were traveling with me had this great idea. Hey, how about we travel ahead a couple of days and do a little sightseeing? You know, none of us have been to Australia before. It'd be a shame to go down there and just see the inside of a conference room and then come home, right? Sure, sounds like a great idea. I hung up the phone, got online, booked my flight to arrive in Sydney 4 days before our business would start. So I'm anticipating the trip, and about a week before I'm supposed to depart, I haven't heard anything from my other colleagues about what the plan is for these 4 glorious days in Australia. So I sent out an email, hey everybody, what are we doing? And people get back to me going, oh, you know, that just isn't going to work for me. I decided not to do it. I figured we only talked about it once. Nobody really was going to book their flights early. And I'm like, what? I did? Like, now I'm stuck. I'm like, I'm going to fly to Sydney. I've never been there. I don't know what's going on. Luckily, one other colleague, a good friend of mine, Melanie, did decide to do the same thing that I did. So I met Melanie at the airport in Sydney with 4 days to kill and 600 miles to travel to our first sales appointment up in Brisbane. So we decided, heck, let's just rent a car, we'll point it north, and we'll visit some different towns along the way. Melanie didn't want to drive because anybody who's been to Australia before knows that the steering wheel is on the right-hand side of the car, and you drive on the left-hand side of the road, which can be quite confusing, but I thought of it as a challenge, right? As long as she agreed to be my navigator. Now, I realized pretty quick that she was going to be a terrible navigator, because we were only about a couple dozen miles north of Sydney when we had our first big decision about which route to take. So Melanie grabs the little guidebook that we had with us and flips the page and goes, the next town coming up, Gosford is a beautiful town 80 kilometers north of Sydney. You have to go to Gosford. She slaps the book closed and she's like, that's it, we're going to Gosford. The book says we have to go to Gosford. So we point the car to Gosford, head down that road. As we get there, I'm like, why on earth would the guidebook have ever told us to come to this town? It's just a big industrial, junky town in a marshy area with a bunch of urban sprawl around it. So I grabbed that book from her, and I noticed that phrase, you have to go to Gosford, was at the end of a page, but not at the end of a sentence. As I flipped the page, I continued on and said, you have to go to Gosford if you want to get to the towns of Turrigal or Bourgeois. And then it went on to say, if your beachgoers should continue along the Sydney to Newcastle Expressway and forego these marshy communities, or something like that. So I'm like, oh God, how did we end up in this town? Melanie was completely apologetic as we sat at lunch at Gosford's really only true tourist destination. It was a reconstructed penal colony, complete with stocks that you could, clamp on your head, and a flogging post. I mean, they didn't have a lot going on in Gosford, obviously. But I said to her, you know what? Hey, Melanie, no worries. And in a moment of enlightenment, I said, there are no bad decisions on this trip, only better ones. Now, I still, to this day, have no idea how those words came to me, but I have repeated them to myself and others hundreds of times since. Because when I think about those words, they really help me step beyond that concept of analysis paralysis. When I get into a situation where I'm hemming and hawing over one decision or another, I go, you know what? Just make a decision. There are no bad decisions, only better ones. If the decision I make doesn't turn out to be a great one, I can learn from it, and I can move on and make a better decision next time. So if you know of anybody who is a perfectionist, procrastinator like me, or struggles with analysis paralysis, I urge you to let them know. Sometimes it's better to make a bad decision and learn from it than it is to delay too long to make a good decision in the first place. There are no bad decisions. There are only better ones.